All right. Welcome. Let's see. That's nice. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining. My name is Emily Scarbeck. I'm an assistant professor here at the Political Theory Project. For those of you who are not aware, the Political Theory Project is kind of dedicated to this idea that ideas and institutions are incredibly important, and we want to understand and look at those ideas and institutions which make societies free, prosperous, and fair. Part of this involves an interdisciplinary approach about bringing together questions in political science with some answers in economics, and basically looking at the question of how it is that market economies interact with democratic governance institutions, democratic ideals, and this is all central to what the PTP is interested in here at Brown. So with this in mind, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Luigi Zingales. Luigi Zingales is the Robert C. McCormack Distinguished Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. In 2015, he also became the director of the Stigler Center at the University of Chicago, where he facilitates research on questions of regulatory capture and distortions that are caused by interest groups that are participatory in the capitalist system. So Professor Zingales' research spans a great number of very interesting aspects of economics and finance, looking at corporate governance. He's investigated issues of trust and the role of culture in the financial system. In addition to his long list of publications in top-tier economics and finance journals, his books include Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists, and more recently, A Capitalism for the People, Recapturing the Lost Genius of American Prosperity. So this afternoon, Professor Zingales is going to be speaking with us on some of the topics related to Italy's role in Europe, and talking about perhaps touching on questions of populism and some of the political economy associated with the European project. Without further ado, Professor Zingales will talk for roughly about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions from the floor. And let's welcome Professor Zingales.
So thank you very much, Emily, and thank you for the long list, long presentation. I want to add one thing that probably is not on my website, is I just started a podcast called Capitalism, What is Working in Capitalism and What Isn't. And the last episode that came out, I think, yesterday, discusses some of the issue about Italy. And so I thought that when I was asked to come here, first of all, I was very pleased because what I'm trying to do at Chicago is a bit what you are doing here, try to connect economics and political science, and not with much success as Chicago. Hopefully here you have more success. And I think there is hardly any topic that is more connected between economics and political science that the current economic and political situation in Europe, and in particular in Italy. And I think that many non-Italians don't get a sense of urgency. When I told my co-host in the podcast, I said, look, the vote in the last election in Italy was worse than Brexit. And she was shocked. And I said, yeah, because actually the British never really liked Europe. If you look at the survey, they were always like 50-40, 50-50, and Italy loved Europe. In the 1980s, 1990s, even early 2000s, 80% of the people were in favor of the European Union and in favor also of the euro. And today, actually, the latest numbers are more like 35%. And the majority of the new members of parliament are from parties that are openly Eurosceptic, let alone the one that allegedly are not Eurosceptic but campaign to some extent against Europe anyway. So I think the world has changed dramatically. And I don't know your background. I don't know exactly how much you know, how much you don't. And please feel free to interrupt me at any time if I go too fast. But I want to do an analogy. By the way, besides the books I've written in English, I have a book that I wrote in Italian, trying to discuss the issue of Europe with my fellow Italians, called Europe or Not. And I have a translation in English that is in a PDF. So if you are interested in this topic, I'm very happy to share with you. And I will share with Emily, and then Emily can share it. Because I think that the issue of is where Europe is going and where Italy is going within Europe, I think is absolutely crucial. And this was crucial before Brexit, when I wrote the book, and it's even more crucial after Brexit and after also the centrifugal forces that are in Eastern Europe. So let me give an analogy that I make in this book that is not really enjoyed by anybody, but I think is right, and I keep insisting because eventually somebody will realize. And there's a very strong analogy between the process of Italian unification that took place a bit more than 150 years ago, and the process of European unification. So for those of you who are not very strong in Italian history, let me give you like a 1-minute version of what happened. There was a small elite that felt Italian. Most people did not feel Italians. They spoke languages that they did not relate to each other. They couldn't understand each other. So it was really a small intellectual elite that felt that Italy should be unified. And in a couple of years, between 1858 and 1860, 7 countries turned into 1.5. And that half was the leftover of the Pope country and Pope state. And basically, Italy got unified against every expectation. And actually, recently I've seen a very interesting paper that looks at the spread of the Italian government bonds and trying to figure out how the financial markets at the time was anticipating the possibility of a breakup, because this strike of luck was not so, at least in principle, so stable, and people were doubting that Italy will actually make it, and it did, but it was not easy. But the country was taken so much by surprise that basically there was a problem of how do you create a legislation for a country that was very different, very heterogeneous. And they solved it in a very simple way. They took all the legislation of the King of Sardinia, basically Piedmont, that was the aggregator of this unification, and they imposed it overnight to everybody else. And to a historian or any political scientist, etc., if you look with an historical perspective, there is no doubt that that legislation was probably more progressive than in most other countries, in most other states in Italy. However, it was not necessarily the right legislation given the conditions of those countries. And just let me give you one example that I find it very illuminating. The example is electoral law. The electoral law actually in Piedmont was pretty progressive because you could qualify either based on income, with still restrictive franchise, but that's not surprising, even the states were restrictive franchise, or based on your education. So you could qualify based on some literacy test. And as a result, the number of voters in Piedmont were decent because literacy among males at the time was fairly high. Then they applied the same law to Campania, Sicily, places like this, where literacy was abysmally low. And the result is that, and this is something that actually I start to realize only when I came to the United States, because say when you have a restrictive suffrage, how do you allocate member of parliaments? How do you allocate seats? Do you allocate based on voters or do you allocate based on people? And reading the US Constitution, I realized you tend to allocate on people, not on voters. And then I check, and in Italy it was true as well. So the South had plenty of people, nobody voted, so a few families were controlling a member of parliament. The key seats were controlled by a few families, and most of them were basically local barons. And later I realized that there was actually a famous book that was saying electoral trip, that was describing exactly that feeling, that was not a campaign, was a visit of a few relatives in an area of rich relatives that were deciding the member of parliament. And what was the result is, after unification, there was a clear alliance between the northern, more progressive part and basically this member of parliaments in the south that wanted to protect their privilege, and they were very effective in making a coalition in parliament, and they got their privilege sort of maintained. And if the South had been an independent country, would never have survived long term with that situation, because it was unsustainable politically. Unfortunately, the Italian army was used to repress that revolt, and so you had the southern barons, helped by the northern bourgeoisie, maintain the South underdeveloped. And the result was dramatic. Most people know today that the South is less developed than the North. Few people know that at unification, Emilia-Romagna, which is the town around Bologna, the countryside around Bologna, just if you don't know Italy so well, had the same per capita income as Sicily. And 100 years later, the gap was almost 2-to-1. And of course, it's not only this, might be that the Industrial Revolution was favoring places with a lot of water. There are all these different theories that this is not just the fault of, but the point is that I subscribe very much to actually a political scientist, probably not very famous outside of an Italian circle, Vincenzo Cuoco, who wrote a book about the history of the 1799 Napoleon's Revolution. This was the revolution that was trying to help the French come to Naples and change the country. And being part of that revolution, it was really a bourgeois revolution. It was suppressed in blood by the local elite help by the British. Admiral Nelson was crucial in that counter-revolt. And after actually being convicted to death and then being able to go to exile, etc., Vincenzo Cuoco reflected on the mistake of this Jacobin revolution in Naples and came to the conclusion that it's stupid to export political models to other countries. And he has this passage that say, constitutions are like clothes, and you want to have the right clothes for the right temperature for the right people. And I always wonder if the neocon in the United States had read Vincenzo Cuoco will never had the Iraq War and a lot of other disasters, because this idea of exporting institution imposing is, in my view, a wrong idea. And so, long story short, what happened is that even for good reasons, you had the North trying to improve the South, and by improving, of course, according to their definition of improvement, led to a desertification that led to emigration. Basically, all the Italian Americans you find in the United States who came here before 1980 come from the South. There are few exceptions, but very few. The one after that, they immigrate to the North, but we have a gigantic depauperation of human capital, because the one leaving are generally the more educated and the more entrepreneurial, the better sort of spirit. And so you tend to leave behind the one who don't have the strength to revolt, to change, to do. And I think that is a big legacy of that unification led to Italy. Now, why did I spend so much time? Because, in a sense, the European Union is a similar construct. The European Union was a dream of a few intellectuals at the end of World War II that said, never, ever again. And you can understand after two world wars that basically destroy the continent twice in the space of 30 years, you are really trying to build a different model, different system, and etc. And the idea was that by having some form of unification, then you will have no war. And what is interesting is this is an article of faith in Europe. So when you actually question the article of faith, say, wait a minute, last time I checked, United States and Canada are not a country, and in the last 200 years, there was no war. So being separate does not mean to be at war. And actually, when you mention the bloodiest war of all in the United States was a civil war. So being a country does not prevent, or being united does not prevent wars. Being separated does not mean wars, okay? And if I had to bet what really kept Europe in peace for so many years was a combination of a Soviet threat and the NATO. Those are the two things that kept things all together. And ironically, the biggest war we had in Europe since World War II was the war of a union that broke up Yugoslavia in the bloodiest possible way. And the same union now is applying piece by piece to be reunified inside the European Union. So all these things are quite paradoxically, but in Europe, they're not discussed. It's an article of faith that, number one, you have to unify to prevent war. And, you know, when the alternative is war, then anything is bearable. If you're saying, if you don't do that, you're going to have a World War III, it's basically saying you have to do that. So that's the first step. The second step is that an inevitable step in that direction is to have a common currency, even without a political union. And the idea, and when you talk to people in Europe, if they're honest, they're very clear about this, they say, look, the Euro project, the common currency, is not an economic project, it is a political project. And this political project based on the idea that the final goal is complete political unification, is by making a step in that direction, you are actually doing a great service to the entire continent. Now, even this is not a foregone conclusion. In fact, if you read Milton Friedman has a piece in the late 90s, he was already pretty old by then, but it was still very sharp, and he wrote this piece against the euro, saying what at the time looked like blasphemy, but it turned out to be so right that it's almost scary, because he said, look, the fear is that pushing a monetary union when there are not the economic condition to do so, rather than creating a better and closer union, will create so much tension that things will fall apart. And when you see the Greeks calling the Germans Nazi and the Germans calling the Greeks lazy, and by the way, until the recent election, the funny thing is that there were more lazy people in Germany. If you look at the number of hours they work per week, the Greeks work much more than the Germans. They're less productive, but they work more. And then if you look at the people voting for extreme left, right-wing party until the last election, there were more Nazi percentage-wise in Greece than in Germany. So those labels are clearly wrong. They are stereotype, but those labels will not have been used 20 years ago. It would be inconceivable for a Greek to call the German Nazi and for a German to call the Greek lazy. Okay? And by the way, with all the political tension that we have in the United States and all the decay in political discourse and political language particularly, I don't think that we had any elected representative anywhere that made fun of a part of the country. They made fun of the Mexican or people outside of the border of the United States, but nobody said, oh, in Louisiana they are lazy or something like that. And in Europe, that's standard. In fact, we had Dijsselbloem, the former, I think, economic commissioner in the EU, a Dutch guy, who said that we don't want to relax the budget rule for countries that spend their money in women and wine. And that was clearly referred to the Southern European country, so Greece and Italy. So that's kind of condescendence. It would be unacceptable even in today Trump's America, let alone before. But that's standard. So the guy said it, he did not even have to resign. That's part of the common language that takes place in Europe. And in this context, I think that Europe started as an economic project, in particular as a way to enlarge a common market, and was extremely successful in that. It was extremely successful in two dimensions, in creating a common market, and also in creating a strong incentive for new democracies to basically improve their institutions and join the European Union. Over time, for those of you who don't know the history, the first treaty of what was then the European Community was signed in Rome. Speaking of how Italy feels strongly about Europe, it was written in Rome in 1957. And then in 1973, Ireland and the UK joined. And then later, they started, all the countries that started to become democratic. So was Greece, was Spain, was Portugal. The first step that we're doing is we're trying to qualify the European Union and become part of the European Union. And then became sort of the Eastern European country. And this was very important. And actually, I've seen with my eyes how powerful that incentive was, because I went to Turkey in 2002. And in Istanbul, you could breathe the sense of Europe. First of all, everything they were saying, this is the biggest thing of Europe. And I'm a bit picky, but I say, look, you have a teeny tiny piece in Europe, because most of Turkey is in Asia. At least when I studied geography, that was the division. But they felt part of Europe, because they were trying to actually qualify for the European, entering the European Union. It was so powerful that they even started to treat the Kurds like human beings, okay? Which for a Turk, it takes a lot, okay? And this was 2002, at the time which there was still hope that Turkey will join the European Union. And then combination of sort of Germany and France said no more. And I went back in 2012. The country was completely different. And of course, Erdogan played a role in this. But you go to Istanbul and you see all the women with a veil, when before the veil was sort of out of the question. You see a completely different attitude, and you see politically how Turkey is now becoming a leader of the Islamic world rather than a part of Europe. And I think that that's just to be remembered. So, in a sense, the European Union, European community did a fantastic job in creating a larger market and in qualifying or moving early democracy into a stable democracy. I think that was great. However, there was a big problem in the European, what was then community, is that because you had to keep basically the French happy, there was a very strong agricultural policy that was extremely difficult to do with flexible exchange rates. Because again, do you have to have the same currency to trade? And the answer is no, because Mexico and Canada are very integrated with the United States with different currency. So you don't need to have the same currency to trade. And I think that it was a good idea to maintain some flexibility, but managing a policy of subsidies to agriculture based on exchange rate that change every day sends all the bureaucrats nuts. And so there was a very strong pressure to have a common currency. And first they had a monetary system that was trying to stabilize the parity. But the monetary system wasn't working very well. Why? Because the most important country was always Germany, and Germany was setting monetary policy. And when Germany was setting monetary policy, everybody else had to either sort of jump to the German tune or be completely at risk of a devaluation, a run, and all these terrible things. And so and this, we saw this very clearly in 92, shortly after German unification. Germany had to increase interest rates to control some of the booming that was coming from unification. That was not appropriate for the rest of the country, and we had the UK get out of the monetary system, you had Italy getting out of the monetary system, you had a lot of disruption. And so at that time, there was a famous agreement between Mitterrand and Kohl, and Kohl wanted the German unification, and Mitterrand said, yes, we let you have the German unification in exchange for a common currency. And Kohl said, yes, the Germans did not want a common currency. Said, yes, we're going to get a common currency, but at our conditions. And so they set the rules very precisely. And this is in a piece that I think is one of the worst example of political misleading. When Mitterrand talked to the French voters, he said that they're going to have a more progressive monetary policy, because now there would be, the French will shape the monetary policy because they have a saying in the central bank and so on and so forth, not recognizing that the rules of the ECB are such that there's no room for progressive monetary policy. Just for those of you who are not economists or not monetary economists, in the United States, the Fed has a dual mandate of price stability and also full employment. In Europe, there is only one mandate, which is price stability. And actually, price stability is defined in a very tricky way that say average inflation below 2%. So it's not even obvious that if you have major deflation, you have violated your mandate. So you basically was enshrined in the treaty these rules, and these rules are less modifiable than the US Constitution. Okay, and I know today is not easy to modify the US Constitution, but there is a process, and historically this is done, and you can even call a national convention if you want. But in Europe, you had to have 17 different countries to agree to that. Okay, and you have to have unanimity basically in 17 countries. This is impossible, and so this is enshrined in the law. And so this was the idea. Now, in doing that, they set some rules for countries to join the European Union. And one of these rules was the fact that you had to have a debt that was not too big. And definition of too big, below 60% of GDP. And when this rule was set in 92, it was clear that two countries, Belgium and Italy, would not qualify, because at the time, they both had a debt to GDP above 100%. And it's not easy to cut down this in a hurry. But Belgium had all the other conditions to qualify. Italy, basically, pretty close to the event, had none. And in a famous meeting, Prodi went to talk to the then leader of Spain, Aznar, and he was trying to say, look, we southern countries should be joining the euro later. And Aznar said, no, we Spain, we're ready. If you Italians are not able to do it, that's your problem. And that is considered like a slap in the face, at least it was described as such in the Italian press. So Italy did everything possible, and even impossible, to qualify for this cutoff. And rumors have it that the accounting was not as perfect, but basically every country cheated, and that's the question is, to what extent you cheated. There are some people cheated a bit, some people did with gusto. Greece is an example, and Italy somewhere in the between Germany and Greece, and then you pick where in this continuum Italy is, but clearly is much more difficult to say no because you cheat when everybody does, and then it's a question of degree. But joining the euro at the time was not unreasonable for Italy for two reasons. One is Italy had survived in the 70s and 80s by doing a lot of competitive devaluations. And these competitive devaluations were so timely that entrepreneurs expected that. So there are very little incentives to actually innovate and go up in the product ladder, because every second year there was a major devaluation that will give them new competitiveness, and they will keep exporting the same stuff. And so the idea of saying we need to maintain a more rigid exchange rate so that actually entrepreneurs are forced to go up in the product ladder was a good idea. The second is that Italy, between the early 80s and the end of the 80s, had accumulated a gigantic debt. And because of the history of inflation, was paying very large interest rate, in spite of the low inflation, was paying basically a huge premium on that debt that made it very difficult for that debt to be sustainable. And so the idea was, we tie ourselves to the German mast, like Ulysses did many centuries before, and by doing that, we have a credible commitment not to inflate, so we can pay less for our debt, and that will make things work. Now, unfortunately, two things, in my view, went the wrong way. The first one is that immediately after we entered the euro, Berlusconi got elected and squandered the euro dividend with gusto. So I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, which is very simple, you can reproduce. Had you kept the fiscal discipline on 97, the year we qualified for the euro, between 97 and 2007, we would have entered. So if you got all the savings in interest and used to repay down the debt, by 2007, Italy would have had a debt to GDP of 60%, which was the level Germany had at the time. Instead, we arrived 107. So that difference is the dividend squandering by Berlusconi during that period. So more expenses, more staff, etc., etc. The second problem, and this is really nobody's fault, except that maybe somebody could have forecast that, is Italy was specialized in manufacturing and got hit particularly hard by the entry of China in the WTO. We know now how much this entry has cost the United States. Imagine a country that is much more exposed to manufacturing than the United States, and also in lower level manufacturing vis-a-vis the United States. So the hit was huge. And so we gave up the exchange rate flexibility precisely at the time where we need it. And my analogy when I talk to broader audiences is saying, look, devaluation is like the drug. If you keep doing it, you get addicted and it's not good for you. However, if you have to do a root canal, doing without anesthesia is not pleasant. It's not pleasant even with anesthesia, but let alone without anesthesia is not pleasant at all, okay? And Italy is doing a root canal without anesthesia, okay? So that's problem number one. Problem number two is, and this is, I think we economists have to take a huge amount of responsibility collectively, because while you can say we didn't predict the fact that we could take responsibility also for the entry of China, but certainly not for Berlusconi. But the third part that we should take responsibility for is the way the euro was designed. So all the macroeconomists are so obsessed with inflation that they design the entire central bank to protect against inflation. Is basically they build a gigantic Maginot line against the enemy of the previous war, and the new enemy was different. And the new enemy was called financial instability and deflation. And the euro area was not in any way prepared for those two things. And in particular, if you run a large debt to GDP ratio, you might be subject to doubt whether you can roll over that debt. And these doubts, we know in economics, can be easily self-fulfilling. Even when you're not, clearly, if you are clearly insolvent, there is nothing you can do. If you're clearly solvent, the doubts will never arise. But when you are borderline, it's not that impossible to have these doubts. And those doubts are self-fulfilling. Why? Because if I start to doubt that Italy will repay me, I will demand a premium on the interest that the Italian government pays, when that premium is going to increase the deficit of Italy, unless you increase taxes, but that will have a negative effect on the economy. And if that makes it less likely, this increases the probability of default, which means requiring higher premium. And so this is a vicious circle that we have seen in action taking place in 2011. So Italy had a very large debt to GDP and was not growing particularly fast. That's the problem. And in addition to that, was hit by the doubt that we'll ever repay. And that doubt was actually triggered by a meeting between Sarkozy and Angela Merkel, where they discuss the so-called private sector involvement in a debt restructuring. And that created the panic that Italy would be next. And that created a spiraling of the interest rate, a huge fiscal adjustment measure done as Italy was slowly resurrecting from the 2008 crisis. So Italy depends very much on export, and in 2008 and 9 got a 20% reduction on export. That was a dramatic shock that led to a 5.6% drop in GDP. So everybody thinks about the United States. The financial crisis in the United States did not lead to such a huge drop of GDP. So the drop in GDP of Italy was much bigger. And as Italy was slowly trying to get out of that ditch, got hit a second time by a second recession caused by this high spread and high interest rates. Okay? And that leads to 2 years of recession. And at the end of this process, 35% of businesses went into default. 35% of businesses. And GDP in real time went down to 10% from 2007 to 2014. And the peak in unemployment was 12%. The peak in youth unemployment was 37%. And this is pretty dramatic. And I didn't want to sort of kill you with too many slides, but I want to show you a couple of slides that give you the sense of how bad the Italian situation is, because from outside, you don't really get the full picture. So this is the per capita income of Italy vis-a-vis US and Germany. And as you can see, Italy basically in 2016 had roughly the same per capita income of 1996. So 20 years without any growth in per capita income. That's pretty dramatic. Now, this is even a more dramatic picture because this shows the per capita income of various Italian provinces relative to the EU average in the last 15 years. So, as you can see, there is not one province in the entire Italy that gained over the EU average. So, was literally downhill, and now Milan, which is considered the cream of the crop, was a bit slower at this peak. Firenze was dramatic, and the south is even more dramatic because it starts from such a low level. There are only 3 regions in the entire Europe where the majority of people are below the poverty line. Those are 3 regions in the Italian south. This is a bit too technical. This you see how the things work. This is productivity, but this is productivity. You see the northeast did okay, northwest and center not much, and the south was a dramatic loss. So Italy did poorly, the south did even worse. And then to finish with the last piece in this is the famous immigration crisis, where Italian governments made a lot of mistakes, but Europe did worse. So, first of all, let me tell you the good news. The good news is that probably the immigration crisis from Libya is the first refugee crisis not caused by the United States. Okay? Because generally, the United States are always involved in some way or another. That crisis is entirely the product of Sarkozy's decision to invade Libya, that initially was broadcasted as an attempt to gain influence at the expense of Italians, by the way. Now there seems to be a darker motivation because, according to recent news, Sarkozy had received illegal campaign financing from Gaddafi and wanted to cover the traces, so wanted to destroy Gaddafi before Gaddafi revealed of that illegal campaign financing. So whatever it is, basically Sarkozy problems created an instability in Libya, created a failed state in Libya that became the launching pad for immigration in Europe. Now, what most Americans don't appreciate is that most immigrants in Italy don't want to go to Italy. So why do they arrive in Italy? Oh, because it's the closest place. If I don't know well, you know your geography, but there are a couple of little islands south of Sicily that are pretty close to Libya. And so it's fairly easy from Libya in a good day to go to Italy. And why do they go to Italy? Because it's part of the EU, and eventually you want to go to Germany, UK before Brexit, or France. However, there is a treaty called Dublin Treaty that says that all responsibility of the people at the border are of the country involved in that. So it's as if all the immigration from Mexico was coming through New Mexico, and New Mexico on its state budget will have to take care of it. And that's not enough, because the treaty says that unlike the European citizen that can move freely across the various countries, the immigrants that ask asylum cannot move from the country receiving them. And so the last few weeks there was a tragic case of a Nigerian woman who was pregnant and died of cancer. She was trying to go to France to reach her sister in order to entrust her kid to be born to her sister. She was pushed back by the French police at the French border and died in a Turin hospital. So this is the level of cooperation of Europe vis-à-vis Italy. So I don't want to sound too negative, but when you see the result of the last election, you see all these populists, or so are called, I think you should actually thank God that we don't have wars. The Italian situation is, in my view, comparable to the one of Germany in the 1930s, where Hitler took power. And with all the defects that you might attribute to the Five-Star Movement, it's no Hitler. There's no doubt. Now, maybe you can discuss whether the League had more like neo-fascist sympathies. It's certainly the connection with the Le Pen movement is not a badge of honor. But I think the Five-Star Movement is not. And while it's resisting immigration, is also very progressive, for example, on environment, and very insistent on being in a cleaner government, to the point that they did something, in my view, unprecedented. They asked all their members of parliament to give back, I think, a third of their salary, not to the party, to the government, in fact, or to the community. So they use that money to finance small and medium enterprises. And the funny thing is, just before the election, all the mainstream media that, of course, see the Five-Star Movement as the barbarian at the gate, started to mount a gigantic campaign about the fact that out of the, 250 members of parliament they had, 10% did not pay the full amount. And, you know, what is surprising is 90% did. And particularly, it seems that they're not particularly good at keeping track, with the possibility of getting away, because 10% did, 90% did, which is remarkable. And that led to a victory. And the interesting thing of the system is that you have the Five-Star Movement winning by a landslide in the south of Italy. In Sicily, they got so many members of parliament that they cannot fill the seats, because they've not put enough candidates to actually elect everybody, because every single member of parliament of Sicily is for the Five-Star Movement. So anything below Naples is basically yellow, because that's a party of the Five Star Movement. Everybody above Florence is controlled by the center-right coalition, of which the Liga is the main party. And the center is basically a center in every dimension, with a little bit of leftover of the Democratic Party, and some district going one direction and district going the other. Now, of course, the very, very complicated situation in which we are in right now is what kind of government we can have in these contingencies, which is very complicated, but we should remind ourselves it's very complicated because the previous government was basically a coalition of the Democratic Party and Berlusconi, changed the electoral law at the last minute to make the country, to make it impossible to anybody to win the election. So if we had instability, it's not because the Italians don't know how to vote, it's not because we're a bad luck, it's because of a concerted effort that was, in some sense, endorsed by the president who had to sign the new law to create a law that will make it impossible for anybody to win, in part because everybody was terrified that the Five Star Movement could win an outright majority. And so now we are in a funny situation in which the Democratic Party, that used to be led by Renzi, who now resigned, did like the kids when they lose at the soccer match. He took the ball and left the game and said, I'm not going to participate in any alliance with anybody. And we see whether the party will survive for a long time in that position, but that's his position. Now, given this, the natural, actually, to me, the most natural alliance was the Five Star Movement and Democratic Party, but the Renzi made this impossible. So technically, there is a possibility of a government for the Five Star Movement and the League together. The problem is the League in the election was allied with Berlusconi, and the Five Star Movement said never will vote with Berlusconi. And I think that this is credible because all their voters will stop voting for them if they renege on that promise. The party was basically started as an anti-Berlusconi party, and if you were to renege on this, it would be the end of the world. And so we're basically in a stalemate that we don't know how to fix it. And a stalemate in Italy, and a stalemate in Europe, because I think that at this point, maybe exiting the euro for Italy could not be the worst thing in the face of earth if this could be done without too much disruption. However, even in the most organized country, exiting a currency union is disruptive. In Italy, in my view, would be devastating because the best way to do these things is do it fast and do it by surprise. In Italy, nothing is by surprise because if you have more than two people involved into any action, everybody knows about it. And so I think that the disruption created is a major problem. So my biggest hope was always that at some point Germany will exit the euro from the top. Then they realize that Germany and the satellite countries around Germany are an optimal currency area. They can leave the euro from the top. It's much easier to leave a currency union from the top than from the bottom. I even found a nice name, Northern Europe, Northern Euro, also called Neuro. And so Germany will be on the Neuro, and the so-called Club Med, Italy and the other countries, will be on the existing euro. The big problem in this plan, and I think what makes it infeasible, is where does France fall? Okay? So economically, France belongs more to the southern part than to the northern part. However, number one, it's not politically feasible for any French president to be part of what they call the Club Med. So is a way to lose the election for sure. And number two is Germany cannot be in a union without France because the European Union was born in this forced marriage between France and Germany to prevent another World War. So breaking that will really break all the assumption of the foreign policy of the last 70 years. And so what is the option? I think that if we had a strong government, maybe a coalition 5-star or Liga, or a coalition 5-star PD, this strong government could try to lever the power of Macron and his activism in trying to reform some characteristic of the European Union. And what is the threat? The threat is, look, imagine that you have a PD 5-star movement coalition. The threat is if we fail, the next one are going to be the Liga that is even more radical than us. So the next one is going to exit the euro. And honestly, this is the nightmare of every French president, but particularly Macron. If Macron has to witness in Italy leaving the euro, this is the biggest gift they can give to Marine Le Pen. So I think that Italy has some capability. The problem, in my view, is, first of all, you need a government to try to do that, and that's hurdle number one. Hurdle number two, the new government does not have a lot of cadre, does not have a lot of middle people that actually carry its policies in an effective way. Especially the 5-star movement, but even the Liga, they tend to be like anti-establishment party with very dedicated supporters, but not much of the intelligentsia. In fact, if you want to be shunned by any meeting in Italy, you express some vague sympathy for the 5-star movement, and you are completely considered persona non grata. Okay, this is the level of political outcast. So this makes it difficult for them to have people that negotiate this stuff in Europe. That would not be an easy stuff. And last but not least, and then I stop here and I will open for question, I think there is a problem inside of Italy. Part of the establishment in Italy sees Europe in an orthopedic function. What does it mean, orthopedic function? Is basically they think that we are unable to govern ourselves. We need some rigid rules to force the people to behave properly. And the Germans provide us these rules. In fact, the CEO at the time, the CEO of a large bank, once admitted to me, he said, we Italians are better off being run by Angela Merkel. I think that somebody say that should be under trial for treason, but this represents actually most of the Italian elite. And so there is really sort of a fifth column of any attempt to reform Europe, because the Italian elite does not want to do that. So if this, and the reason why we have populist party, my favorite line is, the problem is not populist, is elitism. Populists arise because on the other side there is elitism. And I think that the Italian elite has behaved and misbehaved in a major way. And that is what generated this protest vote. Can this protest vote fix the problem? I'm not that optimistic. What I do know for sure, if they don't, the situation will only get worse and the rage can take even worse forms. So I think that this is really a very important moment for Italy and for Europe at large. Thank you.
So it's a lot of very interesting issues to take up in the Q&A. We'll go ahead and open it up to the floor. Do you want to field questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to field questions.
Anyone interested can come down to one of the two mics we have in the room. Or if your voice is loud enough, you can just project strongly. Yes?
So first of all, thank you for that. That was really terrific lecture. I like how you put together this. And so I'm trying to, I guess I wanted to talk about like how the larger argument like sort of fit into some of the details that you did. So the larger argument, I very much liked the parallel between unification of Italy and Europe.
Great, at least we are true.
Yeah. to a coalition. Strange bedfellows had to get together, and as a result of that political coalition, there were a set of economic policies that maybe weren't the right policies for the right time, given that either regions were different or countries were different. And I think that that's a very coherent and good argument. And so I guess what I'm trying to understand, though, is how much did the bad economic policies or practices actually follow from the political project. So if I think about the first analogy of unification, you know, it wasn't just that Sicily had the same GDP as Emilia-Romagna, but that Naples had been an incredibly well-developed city. And then what happened is, as a result of unification, you had a transfer of wealth from the south to the north, until later on it had to be a transfer of people out of Italy or to the north. And it seemed to me like how much of that was a political thing, or how much of that was just sort of idiosyncratic bad policies that added up to that transfer. Likewise, for the EU, as I was listening to your narrative, which was much more detailed, there were pieces where I thought, like, yeah, that was just really stupid policy. That was really stupid economic policy that was maybe informed by other kinds of ideas of what they thought the right thing was, as opposed to it was emanating from the political project. So, for example, the periodic currency devaluations that Italy did in the 70s and 80s and stuff like that. And it's true that it made it, on the one hand, an incentive for them not to invest in R&D and stuff like that, and Italy would always be very low in that. But at the same time, in certain parts of Italy, Veneto, stuff like that, you actually did see upgrades. Right? What is that Copy went from making straw hats to exporting, machine tools or something. That Luxottica came, and all these other the machine tool industry around Verona and stuff like that. It actually were serious upgrading. It wasn't just based on like buy the Italian things because it's cheaper than the German product. And so I try to understand how much. So somehow there was some upgrading and innovation going on, even in the Italian South in the 80s. Remember in the Italian South, that was fun, that you saw some exporting. And then it seemed like this double recession just killed everything. And so I guess I wanted to understand from you how much of it was really the emanation of a not well thought out political project, as opposed to bad luck, bad policy, a combination of these things. And then because based on that, what the lesson to learn from the past is going to help us figure out what Cinque Stelle with whoever might be able to do.
I think is, as often is the case, a combination of the two. In a sense, was there bad luck? Absolutely. In addition to the WTO shock, there is another shock that did not play well with Italy, which is the ICT shock, is the information and communication technology. And I have a paper actually documenting how Italy does very poorly in ICT because there is a complementarity between managerial skills and ICT. And Italy tend to have, let's say, old-fashioned management, more family-oriented, loyalty-oriented, non-meritocratic, and so on and so forth, and stands out in that dimension. So this exacerbated even more the problem. But there are some things that are specific. I think is a combination of some rules that are, as the electoral law for Piedmont, those rules are not bad per se, but they don't combine well with the rest. So take, for example, the budget rule of not having more than 3% of deficit to GDP. Budget deficit to GDP. I think that is not necessarily a bad rule, and particularly for Italy, that has a huge amount of debt, is a good rule. However, this strong limit imposed from the outside, so not owned from the bottom, but imposed from the outside, leads to what? Okay, so we need to qualify. So how you qualify? First you play tricks, which is never a good thing. And actually, we now have $40 billion of debt due to derivatives that we underwrote. My interpretation of that, in order to play tricks, okay? 40 billion is real money, even for a country. And I think that's a pretty dramatic thing. So that's number one. Number two, when you cannot do it with budgetary trick, a bit like the managers, when they cannot manipulate accounting, they manipulate the real variables. That is even worse. So what Italy did is they stopped doing any capital investment. And why? Because if you have to cut, it's much easier to cut capital investment than to cut current expenditure. So in the last 10 years, we saw capital investment drop tremendously. And this, of course, has long-term consequences, the productivity of the country, and so on and so forth. So, again, a good rule or a reasonable rule turned out to be the worst thing. Then, another example, this is a bit more technical because it's from the banking sector, but let me try to translate it for a general audience. There are basically two approaches to bank regulation. When you see that the banks start to go in trouble, either you try to intervene early and force an equity issue and a recapitalization, and so the bank is more resilient, or you close your eyes and hope that with time things will solve themselves. And not surprisingly, Americans start to do more of the first type, and Italians more of the second type. And Germans tend to be more of the first type, and Italians more on the second type. So when the euro crisis hit Italy, that was the second crisis in a row, the Italian banking authorities started to basically ignore the problem, hoping that this will eventually go away. And probably once you start to ignore it, it's very costly to discover along the way. If you discover at the two of the cycle, you're doing the worst possible thing. But what happened is that the German rules arrive when? At the worst moment in the cycle. So we did not recapitalize early, and we were forced to recapitalize in the worst possible moment with devastating effect in the banking sector. And these effects are long-lasting in the future. So in my region, Veneto, two of the three main banks were bought by the other. So there is a major consolidation. And this is dramatic for small firms. So the secret of the small firms in Italy and of the Mittelstand, the small firms in Germany, is actually the banking sector. In Germany, there are a lot of small cooperative banks that finance the small firms. And the same is true in Veneto. You consolidate dramatically the banking sector, and those firms cannot operate because they are basically taken advantage by the banking sector. So this has long, and I can keep going. So I'm not saying that in any way that Europe was evil, okay? I don't want, and most of the time, Europe had the right rules, especially for more developed countries. And Italy benefited by and large to have more progressive rules, which is good. But the combination of a country that is struggling and rules that are not made with a country that's struggling is a very difficult combination. I think that in Italy, soccer analogies always sound very well. So I pick a small team of a place in the Marche, San Benedetto. There's this team called San Benedettese, which is basically a third division team. And I say, if you are the San Benedettese, you cannot play in first division. And maybe if you're really sort of strong, you can play in second division. If you play in first division, it's not even fun. You're beaten up every day, morning to evening, and you're not learning anything. And the idea, in a very sort of optimistic way, when we joined the euro, etc., we said, we're going to do it, and then the country will follow. Is an expression, it actually is a fascist expression, but it's still quite popular in Italy. You throw your heart on the other side of an obstacle. And the idea is a beautiful metaphorical expression, because when you throw the heart, you hope that the rest of the body will jump as well. And Italy did throw the heart, and the rest of the body is still on this side, and that's not a pleasant situation.
So I have a question about the analogy you drew between Italian unification and the unification of Europe. So you began the story with a story about interest-group capture, for example, and the origins of the common agricultural policy. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about if that analogy holds for Italy, for example. If my understanding is correct, in Sicily, roughly 2/3 of the agricultural land was held by as baronial states. by large landowners. To what extent did that interest group capture facilitate and reinforce the unification project in order to prevent the breaking up of these landed elites, which was attempted during unification?
Oh, there is a very rich literature in Italy about exactly that pact between the industrial north and the barons in the south. And in particular, after unification, they did introduce protectionist policies that will favor the baron in the south because the price of wheat was higher, but they will compensate by having a lot of protectionism on the industrial products so that it made it very expensive for the south to catch up or to buy industrial stuff. So that coalition took place all the time. And even Gramsci wrote about this in a very extended fashion. So I'm not saying anything new here. It's well established. I studied in high school, and that was ages ago. So I think that is a very well established that coalition. The thing that this is maybe my stupidity, but I did not appreciate in high school, and I only appreciated because I started to think about the difference between voters and people, is that this policy was based on an electoral law that was giving a huge amount of power to the barons. And if you had started a system with more literacy, the world would have been dramatically different. But of course, and that was self-reinforcing because in the South, the barons did not do anything to improve literacy. And so actually, the South arrived at the end of World War II in disaster situation. And probably most people don't know, but the idea of the Marshall Plan came to Americans when they saw the Sassi in Matera. Because in Matera, you have this, now there are beautiful places you go, there's five-star hotel, etc. But Matera, there were caves, and people were living in caves. So the Americans land in Italy, and they basically find cavemen. So what is happening? And that is one of the motivating factors. And even the redistribution of land, I think one of the policies that was done after World War II was to break up this latifondi, and it was one of the progressive things done, and also a push for more effective education throughout. But the thing that is pretty scary, if you look at the statistics, now mine is a few years old, so maybe, but I don't expect to have changed dramatically. The majority of the workforce in southern Italy had no more than 8th grade in terms of education. Okay? That's pretty scary. How can you compete in a global world with computers, etc., with at most an 8th grade sort of degree? And I'm sorry to say, in 8th grade, most of the time, which in schools that are not at the front of the distribution, because many of my Italian colleagues abroad, etc., have this phenomenal perception of Italian school, which in part is true because they all come from the center of rich towns, and they went to the public school in the center of rich town. They were fantastic. The greatest deal I have in my entire life is high school, because I think for the 5 years, I probably spent $20. My father spent $20 for 5 years of education, and I had phenomenal professors. If you were living in the periphery in the south, it was not the same. And so I think that and the PISA statistics by the OECD demonstrate that if you go to Trento, in Trento, the Italian schools are competitive with Finland. Unfortunately, in Sicily, I don't want to enter in which country they're competitive with. Yeah.
Can you comment further on this dynamic between elitism and populism, particularly as it might be playing out here in the United States, and whether or not the experience in Italy, or for that matter in Europe, is going to serve as an analogy, or it's going to be something very different?
So I think that there are a lot of analogies. The thing that is different is that until recently, Italy did not have a race problem. In fact, all the races was between North and South. Was not with black because they weren't there. Now they start to become, but they're not enough to become really a political issue in the way this plays in the United States, for example. But keeping this aside, the rest is very similar, and I actually were able to have early insights about Trump, for example, by my experience with Berlusconi, having seen Berlusconi in Italy. And I strongly recommend, and last September, the Stigler Center co-organized a conference with Harvard Law School from the title, Populist Plutocrats, A Lesson from Abroad, in which we're not talking about Trump, we're talking about Berlusconi, Taksim in Thailand, in the Philippines there are even two, Duterte, and before that Estrada, and then in Peru, Fujimori. And what is fascinating when you look one after the other, and you can go to the Stigler website and we taped everything so you can enjoy these panels with people from each country, so it was quite interesting. And once you put them one after the other, you can see very clearly some common trends. So why these populist plutocrats succeed is because the existing elite has failed in a major way. So in the case of the Philippines, it was terrorism. In the case of Peru, was inflation. In the case of Italy, there was Operation Clean Hands, and there was an entire sort of corruption scandal. So all this is the sense that the normal situation has failed. And of course, in the United States was the financial crisis and the economic consequence of the financial crisis. Once this is established, then the more you are hated by the mainstream media, the more votes you get. So the Estrada in the Philippines was an actor in soap opera or stuff like that. So it was really a flimsy guy, not particularly serious, that nobody took seriously. He was considered a buffoon. The other side, there was the Aquino, the widow of the famous leader. But she represented the establishment. This guy, everybody started to make fun of him. The more they were making fun of it, the more votes they were getting. And if that reminds you of Trump, that's exactly what it is, okay? Every article in the New York Times against Trump is one more vote, or maybe 10,000 or more votes for Trump. And they don't understand it. I wrote an editorial more than a year ago saying exactly this point. And what Trump has learned from Berlusconi, or maybe is a natural feeling, is how to trigger the Pavlovian reaction in the opponent. Berlusconi was a master. Let me tell you this, in 2001, there is a campaign, and he announces to his entourage that the slogan will be, and now maybe you help me translate because I always find it difficult to translate in English. It doesn't give the same meaning. The statement in Italian is un presidente lavoratore, okay? Blue collar worker, how do you say? A blue collar president. Now, at the time, Berlusconi was the richest man in Italy, okay? So it takes some guts to actually go out with a slogan like this. When he presented to his entourage, they look at him and said, no, this is too much, okay? He completely ignored them, again, exactly like Trump, completely ignored them, went and won by a landslide. Why? Because the entire campaign was about this slogan and how ridiculous this slogan was. So there was no issue about economic policy, about industrial policy, about immigration, about anything. It was all about the slogan. And, he ends up winning. The guy is a master. As of yesterday, he has basically lost this election because there was this, in the center-right coalition, there was this agreement that the party who got the most vote would appoint the leader of the coalition. And the League got more vote than him, so now the alleged leader of the center-right is this guy Salvini. And they go to talk to the President of the Republic, they come out, and the leader of the coalition give his press conference. As he gave the press conference that was agree with Berlusconi before, because it's a coalition, Berlusconi mimics him on the side, making fun of him. At the end, he takes the microphone and basically adds stuff to what he said. This guy is 82 now. He's a magician in acting, because the sense that everybody in Italy got is that he is in power and the other guy is a buffoon. And he did it in 30 seconds on TV. But he has a sense of the act that I think is unprecedented. Yet you have to give it to the guy, because he's really talented in this. Unfortunately, it's not a skill useful to govern, it's useful to collect votes, but he has this sense. And so I think that all this stuff is coming to a rooster. So the thing that to me is fascinating and reaffirm what we've seen in the Brexit campaign, actually less in the Brexit campaign, but certainly in the Trump campaign, is in the Five-Star Movement had basically every newspaper and every TV against. Okay? Now, how can you get 32% of the popular vote without having a lot of money and having all the media against? I think that until recently, this was inconceivable. Inconceivable. And why this happened? Because the media are so disqualified that people actually find it attractive to vote. The more you pile up, the more they vote for this guy. Now, again, not so sure that these are the right people to change the world, but this is the sense of revenge that people have. And I think that all this stuff applies clearly also to the United States and to Europe in general. Now, I think what is different is the situation in Italy is much worse than in the United States or the rest of Europe, and so the resentment is bigger. What I find it hard, and actually last night I was talking with a guy who works at the Boston Fed who is Polish, and I was asking about Poland, because in Poland you have now a populist movement, and Poland economically is doing pretty well. So how can you explain such a big thing? And again, he was able to give me an economic interpretation, the fact that the conservative government before made two big mistakes. One, raided the private pension to pay for the budget, and everybody still hates that, is one of those things that people don't forget. And the other is during the 2008-2009 crisis, they thought to concede to the entrepreneurs or to the industrialists as a temporary measure to allow new workers to be hired basically with no protection, no social contribution, as a temporary measure. That was not a terrible measure, except that in Italy we say there is nothing as permanent as the temporary. This was introduced as a temporary measure in 2009. It's still there. And of course, that created a lot of resentment. One graph that I should have brought here, that I saw the other day, was stunning, is the wealth of the Italians and the condition by generation. And basically, if you're below 45, you got screwed big time. And if you look at the statistic, the votes for the Five-Star Movement is all in the younger people. All the people vote the Democratic Party, and ironically, they present themselves as a leftist party. They are voted in the center of town. The center of Rome is the only place where they won by a landslide, and the center of Milan. This is the so-called party of the left. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I might dispute whether America's place, or the catalyst for America's place in electing Trump was really the banking crisis. I viewed it more as the Gordian knot that precedes that by 20 or 30 years. But one thing that you raised that could take us off perhaps the political analogy to which we're sensitive is the loss of human capital. In that point, you were going back many years to immigration in the United States, and while you posed some possible solutions that are difficult that you saw from an economic perspective, I didn't hear whether you see any possibility for bringing back, in the way that people now look at that as having happened perhaps in Africa or perhaps comparably in Ireland. Is there a sense that, in the way you're here in America communicating this, that Italian Americans or Italians abroad might return that human capital or participate in improving the situation?
It's a very good point, and I should have answered earlier to your question that also one of the factors is in the recent years there have been a lot of immigration of educated Italian. 100,000 a year, and those tend to be the high human capital people. So I think the idea of a grand return of these people, first of all, is difficult. Take my case now, I'm married with an American woman, it's sort of my kids are here. It's hard to sort of, and even I sometimes dream of going back, but I'm saying it's not easy in this situation. But interestingly, there is no much sense that in Italy they want you back. And the former Ministry of Labor, actually still Ministry of Labor, but the government is a take care government or caretaker, whatever, said that if they've gone, we're happier that they left. So the fact that people have emigrated, say one less competitor here. I'm happy to let them go. And very often now, with the kind of nationalism, is you have that sense that I'm paraphrasing, but I'm not fully mentally Italian because I actually study abroad and I speak English and I deal with people who are not. Now, I'm paraphrasing because this is what happened to my colleague Raghu Rajan when he became governor of the Central Bank of India. He got some internal opposition in India, and in spite of the fact he never took US citizenship, he remained an Indian citizen, because of the fact he had a green card, he was accused of not being fully mentally Indian. And it's funny because you see him, he's really Indian. In fact, he's a Brahmin, so more like a pure breed Indian that cannot be in any dimension. And I know him well. I think his mentality is really very dedicated to the country. But the fact you have some view abroad is seen as disloyalty and sign that you're not one of us.
So we're getting close to time. If there are any further questions or anyone would like to follow up with Professor Zingales, we will have some refreshments in the back. But otherwise, join me in thanking